Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Suraj Lakhani. I'm an associate professor at the University of Sussex, and I also have various roles within VOX Pol as well. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to this VOX Pol webinar, which accompanies the recently published United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Institute and VOX Pol joint report entitled Right and Left-Wing Violent Extremist Abuse of Digital Technologies in South America, Africa, and Asia. It's a much needed piece of work which focuses on the abuse of digital technologies in particular regions in the global south, regions that are often either under-researched or where existing research is often not given the prominence needed, particularly in the West. As the report says itself, and I quote, "In addition, we need to think more about the transnational and global permeation of extremism, which was once often confined to geographical spaces due to issues around mobility and resources, in turning limited exposure to where we are now, where extremists can disseminate propaganda, ideological stances, recruitment, radicalization, attack planning, both effectively and inexpensively. This report forms part of UNICRI's effort to investigate the threats stemming from the complex interplay between terrorism, violent extremism, and cybercriminality, threats that are often overlooked owing to the difficulty of gathering evidence and attributing offensive cyber operations and to the prioritization of more pressing security threats in diverse geographic locations. So it's clear that this report is much needed and welcome at a time where violent extremists' abuse of technologies continues to be of major concern to numerous governments, law enforcement, policymakers, and academics around the world. This is particularly the case, as we all know, where access to the internet continues to spread further across the globe and becomes more accessible to more people, particularly through the emergence of various services, including Starlink. Access to online spaces potentially have, of course, great benefits, as we've seen, but also can be exploited by malign actors for various nefarious purposes. In addition, we need to think more about the transnational and global permeation of extremism, which was once confined to geographical spaces due to issues around mobility and resources, in turn limiting exposure, to where we are now, where extremists can disseminate propaganda, ideological stances, engage in recruitment, radicalization, attack planning, both effectively and, importantly, inexpensively as well. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our discussants for today. The first is the report's primary author, Arthur Bradley. Arthur is an independent consultant who specializes in OSINT, online investigations, and terrorist propaganda ecosystems. His affiliations include the VOX-Pol Institute, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Human Digital, and he is an external contributor on right-wing extremism for Janes. The second speaker is Ottavia Galuzzi, who provided the overall guidance and editing of the report. Ottavia is an associate expert at UNICRI, where she works on projects aimed at preventing and countering cybercrime and online harms. So the outline of today, Ottavia will introduce the concept of the research project. Arthur will then talk for a while about the report findings and focus on one or two case studies. We'll then go back to Ottavia for an overview of the report's recommendations and outline the next steps in terms of UNICRI's programmatic activities on the topic. And then we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A. Before we hand over to our speakers, I'd like to remind you that you can post your questions for our discussants in the Q&A box, and I'll get to these at the end. Okay, over to you, Ottavia.
Thanks a lot, Suraj. Just let me quickly share my screen. Okay. Yeah, I think you see the presentation, right? So thanks again for the very nice introduction, and thanks to actually all VOX-Pol colleagues who had this brilliant idea of having this webinar today, and thanks of course to Arthur for again being the brain behind this report. So before starting talking about the report called Right and Left-Wing Violent Extremist Abuse of Digital Technologies in South America, Africa, and Asia, I would like to just give a few words about UNICRI for those who don't know it. So we are the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, and we are the only UN research and training institute focusing on the topic of crime prevention, criminal justice, and the rule of law. As a UN institute, we do offer a series of technical tools and tailor approaches to deal with often niche thematic areas. And we do this by action-oriented research, like the research we talk about today, but also policy guidance, professional and academic training, and capacity building programs. The way we do research, of course, it goes it's a bit different from academic research per se, but we tend to initiate research based on the request of a member state or any other stakeholders we work with, or we can initiate research because based on our own assessment of specific threats. And we tend to use the findings and recommendations of our research projects to design and implementing programmatic activities to respond to key and emerging threats. And this last part is going to be covered at the very end of this presentation. So going into the meat of today's presentation, so I would like to tell you a bit about the research objectives and scopes. Okay. So as mentioned, this report has been done in partnership with VOX-Pol, and at UNICRI it falls within our workstream on cybercrime and online harms, through which we aim to explore the interplay of different cyber threats and harmful behaviors, seeking to develop inclusive and rights-based solutions to address the convergence of different crimes happening online, from cybercrime to terrorism, violent extremism online, child exploitation, and hate speech. And this report is a very important milestone for us because it allows us to look into all these different online threats at once. This report specifically, it builds upon a report we did last year jointly with UNOCT, specifically on how terrorists and violent extremists use the dark web and cybercrime as a service, which is a topic that we have covered also in this specific report. And it's also complementary to ongoing research we are working on at the moment. One piece specifically on the intersection of gaming and violent extremism in Africa, and a follow-up on Southeast Asia, and a separate study on the empowerment of cybercrime and online harms victims in Africa. But so to really further our understanding of all these threats, we launched this research project last year, where we aim to look globally and in particular geographies, the online presence, activities, and trends of right-wing and left-wing violent extremist movements in the regions mentioned before, as well as the cyber-enabled threats these movements and individuals could pose to global security. So as you can see in this slide, here are listed our research questions, and I would like to draw your attention on the last two, meaning that beyond looking into the mere activities of these networks, movements, and individuals, we were also interested in seeing if there was a potential collaboration with other malicious actors in cyberspace, namely cyber criminals and activist collectives. But we also wanted to understand if these violent extremist movements, networks, and individuals have the intent and ability to mount offensive cyber attacks, and if so, at what scale. Then, as part of the research, we gather recommendations for identifying and preventing and disrupting this type of threats, and we will cover them later on. And as mentioned at the beginning, what we aim to do with these actionable findings and recommendations is really to create programmatic activities, so concrete follow-up projects that we are working on at the moment. And a few words about the research geographical scope. So the reason behind this, and Suraj actually mentioned that a bit already, so we decided to focus on South America, Africa, and Asia with a selection of specific case studies. As you can imagine, because of lack of time and resources, we couldn't go over every countries in these regions, but we did our best. And the reasoning behind is because we think there is a comparatively little has been published about the online activity of right-wing and left-wing violent extremist movements in these regions, unlike those in Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. And the evidence gathered from this report and other literature we have consulted demonstrate that right and left-wing violent extremism is not confined to the global north, and growing trends show that locally contextualized narratives and propaganda are proliferating in the global south, forging connections to the broader right-wing and left-wing violent extremist movements globally. And we think this is very important given the transnational and global nature of these threats continue to hinder the multi-stakeholder efforts to counter these growing networks. Just a few words about definition, even though I'm going to leave this to Arthur, who will present this in a moment. But what I would like to mention for this work is that, as you might know, there is no international agreed definition of the term violent extremism. And so for this research, we use the UNESCO definition that Arthur will refer to in a moment. But bearing in mind the consideration of the UN Secretary General's Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism, and in particular, two considerations: that the definition of violent extremism is ultimately the prerogative of member states, but such definition must be consistent with country obligations under international law, in particular, human rights law. And I think I will pass it now I will leave the floor to Arthur, who's gonna give a presentation of the research findings in more depth. Thanks a lot, and Arthur, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ottavia, and Suraj also for the introduction. Yeah, so you can dive straight through to the next slide. I'll kind of give a bit of an overview of the methodology, which was in three parts. So first was a fairly extensive lit review, looking at the regions and these kind of manifestations of violent extremism there, particular national context of concern, with a particular focus on their abuse of technologies and the kind of tech sector responses. Secondly, there were interviews with a group of experts, so 31 experts either based in or experts on the topics of the region's frozen topics of concern, or kind of representatives from tech or law enforcement sectors, also with expertise in this area. And then thirdly, obviously, we're looking at manifestations of extremism on the internet. So there's an open source investigative component as well. Once we'd identified the groups, networks, and kind of geographical regions that we were looking at, we conducted open source investigations into those movements. Platforms and websites on the service web, deep web, and dark web, all kind of within scope for that investigation, social media, messaging apps, file sharing services, etc. On to the next slide, please. So obviously there are a few limitations with the case studies and the way in which we were able to select them. So first is the presence of right or left-wing violent extremism, particularly online in some of these regions. That there just simply wasn't quite as much content on the internet as there might have been in other parts of the world. Also, just kind of the diversity in the different regions that we were looking at, and the global nature of the phenomenon made it difficult really to kind of draw overarching conclusions, although I will get onto that in a moment, that are able to apply to kind of such a diverse range of geographical contexts and movements. I think I said a moment ago that the literature was quite substantial. Probably could have carried on doing that for another couple of years, to be honest. So yeah, there's a limitation there in terms of time and capacity to kind of get through all of that literature. And I think I've already touched on the geographic diversity, so we can move straight through. Yeah, so and on definitions, as Ottavia said, probably everyone who's watching knows the difficulties of defining terms like extremism and terrorism as well. But for the purposes of this report, we referred to UNESCO's definition. So the beliefs and actions of people who support or use violence to achieve ideological, religious, or political goals, including terrorism and other forms of politically motivated and sectarian violence. Happy to discuss that maybe in the Q&A later on if people want to. Likewise, real difficulties with defining kind of what we mean by right wing and left wing in the context of violent extremism. So rather than necessarily kind of coming up with a bona fide definition of those terms, we kind of identified, mostly from literature, kind of the key characteristics that you might be able to find within those forms of extremism. And I'll apply those to the case studies, but I think I'll get to them in a couple of slides' time. So that's the kind of methodology and some of the definitions and what we mean. So we can go straight into the executive summary, kind of the key findings of the research. And we've got 6 of these. So the first is something that definitely has been identified in North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. But we found this to be true also in the case study countries we're looking at in the global south, which is that groups or hierarchical organized name groups are kind of increasingly being superseded by more ephemeral, disparate, and horizontal online networks. And really that this makes countering, identifying, and tracking these kind of movements more difficult in the online space. Tied to that first finding is that these networks are simultaneously using kind of a multitude of online platforms, and really key to being able to track and identify the networks is the way that they link between different platforms and split their communication between the services. Third is that the consensus among, I think, all of the experts that we interviewed is that the threat of cyber attacks from non-state violent extremist groups or kind of ideologically motivated cyber attackers is likely to increase in the coming years. However, based on kind of what we currently know about the operations of these kind of actors, is that the vast majority of cyber attacks are carried out by either state-backed or financially motivated actors rather than necessarily ideologically motivated ones. And then in terms of responses, again, the kind of consensus from the literature, from the interviews, and also from the open source kind of investigation is all pointing to the technology sector, most of which is, or the largest companies are mostly based in the US, don't appear to be allocating sufficient resources to the global south, at least comparatively to the global north. There's a lot of different kind of complications that you can add to this, one of which is around definitional issues on terms like terrorism and extremism, which can vary kind of wildly depending on the context in which you might be talking about it, and the tensions that the kind of variations in definitions when it comes to tech company policy probably also contributes to that. Fifth and tied to number 4 really is indications that tech companies are still having kind of fairly serious difficulties in moderating content in languages other than English. And, we're not even just talking about other kind of pretty common international languages like Spanish and French, but also particularly if we're looking at local dialects, in particular parts of India, for example, and also when those dialects are using particular context or slang, really means that the content is kind of going unmoderated. And then 6 is around, an increasing number of jurisdictions around the world are coming up with their own forms of online regulation. And quite often these regulations obviously are not the same to each other, and that kind of places these international companies in a pretty challenging position to be able to enforce their policies consistently when these different regulatory regimes are different and sometimes even contradict each other. And also adding to that, companies are often under pressure from kind of certain political or cultural contexts. And again, kind of there can be a tension between their operations in one country to another. So that also makes it difficult. Go on to the next slide. Okay, so just to kind of put a bit of framing as to what we mean by the abuse of digital technologies, we have borrowed a taxonomy from Jonathan Brickey from CTC Sentinel in 2012 around categories of digital abuse. And as someone who's worked in kind of tracking online extremism for a few years, I'd say probably most of the research focuses on the top one, which is enabling actions. And these are kind of operations online that enable other kind of actions for extremist groups. So recruitment, radicalization, planning. This is things like posting a tweet, sharing a video, or sending a message internally within a group. Second is the disruptive cyber operations, and this is when we get into online actions that have a real direct impact. So things like web defacement, data breaches, DDoS attacks, hacking, and phishing attacks. As the kind of name suggests, these are things that don't necessarily cause immediate and lasting damage, but they're kind of disruptive to whatever the target might be. And then the clues in the name for destructive cyber operations, these are kind of the most serious and egregious, normally kind of cyber attacks, so malicious software, code injection, botnets, etc. And these are things that can actually kind of cause lasting damage to whatever the target might be. And so as a kind of overview of our findings on this particular area of the report is kind of that, first of all, we found minimal evidence of engagement in destructive or disruptive cyber attacks by the groups and networks that we're talking about. It seems that generally there's currently a lack of intent to prioritize offensive cyber operations over kind of more traditional forms of violence. Number of reasons why this could be. One might be a lack of internet infrastructure, possibly also just a perception that kind of the effort isn't really worth the potential reward. But that was a kind of top line finding. However, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it's likely that these kind of cyber attacks are probably going to increase in the coming years. I think the risk of this is particularly acute in national contexts where cyber security defenses are less developed, and also, frankly, particular targets in more developed countries where cybersecurity defenses aren't as good. And also that there is a heightened risk as kind of, let's say, for example, hackers, libertarian hackers and right-wing extremists, there's potential for kind of ideological convergence there. And that kind of contributes to potential risk of radicalization and collaboration between, criminal and ideologically motivated actors. And also within all of this, we observed quite a significant degree of interest and expertise in tactics to maintain the anonymity and kind of operational security among the violent extremist movements. Things like the use of privacy-focused technology, selecting particular browsers for their features, VPNs, etc. And then, this is an example really of the concern that there could be an overlap between the cybercrime and more ideologically motivated actors. This is a dark web market, kind of where different types of hacking software or services are for sale. I should say we didn't find indications that violent extremist movements are using this, although, as I say, the kind of risk of ideological convergence, for example, a lot of these kind of hacking communities are often misogynistic, potentially racist. So there is overlaps there in terms of worldview, and there's the potential, but we didn't see evidence of it happening yet. And actually probably should have put some of the case study overviews before I said all of that, but I'll get into the case studies now just to give you a sense of which particular context we're talking about. So these are the 6 case studies that we included in the report. Right-wing extremism in India, in the context of violent right-wing Hindutva extremism or Hindu nationalist extremism. Also in the Indian context, we looked at the Communist Party of India Maoist, or the kind of Naxalite insurgency there. In South America, we looked at a anarcho-primitivist and kind of anarchist-aligned group called ITS, who mounted a series of bombings in South America and also in Europe, kind of since 2016. We looked at right-wing violent extremism in Brazil, Afrikaner right-wing extremism and white supremacy in South Africa, and also relatively emerging forms of online right-wing extremism in maritime Southeast Asia. We don't have time during this webinar, unfortunately, to go through all 6 of those, so we're going to focus on 2, with Brazil and South Africa. So in the Brazilian context, as a kind of broad overview of the kind of ideology and belief system of the form of extremism we're talking about here, there are parallels between Brazilian right-wing extremism and right-wing extremism elsewhere in the world. So rejection of feminism, multiculturalism, and kind of globalism, in quote marks. And in Brazil, there is a kind of combination of domestic drivers and the domestic historical context. So legacies of Nazism and militarism in Brazil, but there's also strong international influences and connections between Brazilian right-wing extremists and movements in places like America and Europe. So groups like Atomwaffen Division, James Mason's Siege and Siege Culture, Order of Nine Angles, Temple of Blood, and kind of the alt-right in North America are all closely connected, and there are kind of influences on Brazilian extremism there. We're also doing this research in the context kind of following Bolsonaro's administration, where glorification of the armed forces kind of was a particularly strong part of that kind of administration. And for example, in the insurrection attempts on government buildings in Brasilia in January 2023, Telegram and WhatsApp, for example, played a significant role in that incident. And to talk a bit to some of the particular threat actors, really in terms of kind of violent extremist movements, I'd split it into 2 kind of main buckets. Lone actors and small cells. So there's some examples of some attacks there in 2022 and 2023. And kind of neo-Nazi, small kind of neo-Nazi cells, one of which was the Hammerskins. That's a reference to an American group that we looked at. And then also, interestingly, a kind of Duginist group called the New Resistance, who well, their website is hosted in Moscow. They're very explicitly kind of pro-Russia and supportive of the Russian side of the war in Ukraine. And have actually coordinated kind of South American foreign fighters to go and join the war in Ukraine. So there's potential overlap between this group and kind of disinformation, and that's one of the kind of recommendations around kind of the overlaps between different forms of online harms. And as I say, kind of tied to the New Resistance group, there's also misanthropic division in the context of foreign fighters in Ukraine. Some Brazilian members of that group have also travelled to Ukraine, sorry. And then more recently, it's not covered in the report, but kind of Brazil is also unfortunately feeling the effects of the kind of 764 network and the kind of latest iteration of the Order of Nine Angles and youth radicalization with a bomb plot in Rio earlier this year. And as kind of context for the online space, there's some stats here from the report on complaints regarding kind of right-wing extremist content on the internet in Brazil. Pretty significant increase in complaints between 2017 and 2021, just kind of showing the scale of the problem. And Brazil is a country that particularly kind of engages with audiovisual content, and this is reflected in the prevalence of some kind of right-wing extremist content on platforms like TikTok and YouTube. One of the organizations that interviewed as part of this is NetLab, who's done some really good research on the monetization of kind of right-wing extremism on mainstream platforms in Brazil, really contributing to a blurring of the lines between extremism and mainstream public discourse. Likewise, right-wing extremist movements are particularly active on private and more insular online spaces, so WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, and Discord. And likewise, there's a pretty significantly sized Brazil-focused section on Stormfront in Portuguese, so 1.6 million views. Which say Stormfront's a notorious white supremacist forum. And then Brazil likewise has its own network of Chan sites comparable to 4chan and 8chan, which are particularly popular in the global north countries or English-speaking communities. So 55chan, Dogola-chan, Hispa-chan, and also 4chan are kind of all sites that we reviewed as part of this research. The kind of culture and content on these sites is comparable to sites like 8chan. There's trolling, doxing, death threats, attack glorification, incitement are all pretty commonplace. And the Gola-chan in particular has been linked to, I think, several acts of real world violence, including school shootings. And likewise, it's been known to be kind of a source of child sexual abuse material. We did observe, so one of the screenshots on the bottom left there is an OPSEC board on Dogola-chan. I should say it's also a dark web version of the site because it has gone offline on the surface web, or at least it did when we did the research, talking about kind of how to obtain, hacking resources and how to mount kind of data breaches and those kind of things. On the right-hand side is a post glorifying a school shooting in Brazil. And I think also this is a particular case that just shows the relationship between hacking and extremism. It doesn't necessarily have to be extremist to mount the cyber attacks for it to have an impact on extremism in any particular context. So there was a DDoS attack and a database leak targeting the electoral court in Brazil in 2020 during the elections. Probably would describe it as a disruptive cyber attack rather than destructive, in that it resulted in downtime to the electoral website and some of its services. According to SaferNet, the attack aimed to kind of discredit the court, obviously during an election. And the incident coincided with a delay in the vote count, which wasn't connected to the hack, but kind of the combination of those two events triggered a real rise in right-wing conspiracy theories around the fraudulent election. And obviously, this was a few years before the incident in Brasilia. And as it turns out, the perpetrator that was eventually identified was a teenager based in Portugal, who described himself as anti-government, but hadn't or claimed not to have intended to fuel conspiracy theories in Brazil. So that was one of the case studies we looked at in Brazil. And so on to the second case study that the report covers in South Africa, obviously in very different domestic context. And right-wing extremism in South Africa stems from long-standing nationalism among the Afrikaner community, and also kind of a latent sense of racial supremacy. There is also an ongoing resistance to integration with other ethnic groups, and that's gone on since before, during, and after apartheid, particularly against kind of Black South Africans. There is still a desire among kind of these Afrikaner right-wing extremists to establish their own independent ethno-state. And there's also an influence of a fringe kind of religious belief system called Israel Vision, which kind of contributes to white supremacy, or perception of white supremacy and racism in that context. In the report, we track kind of the history of some of the violent extremist attacks by these groups, kind of concentrated mostly in the 90s and 2000s. But there was also a plot more recently in 2019 from a group called National Christian Resistance Movement, or Crusaders. On to the next slide, please. So again, just kind of drawing more on the context in which this extremism is manifesting. South Africa struggles with a pretty high violent crime rate, particularly including burglary and murder. And these issues are very prominent in the narratives of right-wing extremist groups in South Africa, and also globally. Incidents of crime involving Afrikaner or white victims, despite them taking up kind of a small minority of violent crime in general in South Africa, there's a perception, or they're pushing this perception, that the crimes are racially motivated, and kind of these fit, in their view, fairly neatly into claims of ongoing white genocide or great replacement. And that's kind of really leading to connections between South African right-wing extremists and right-wing extremists around the world. I mentioned Israel Vision before. As I say, this is a niche religious philosophy in South Africa, but fairly prevalent among violent extremist movements. It was linked to, there's two plots or attacks from movements in South Africa there that believed in that religious movement. In general, the threat picture from violent right-wing extremism in South Africa has reduced kind of since the 90s and early 2000s. The kind of rate of violent attacks has dropped since that time. But as I was kind of saying before, the narratives probably still resonate with certain sections of the population, particularly around marginalization or perceived marginalization of the Afrikaner community, crime issues, and around kind of land requisition by the government. But there are several paramilitary Afrikaner groups that remain active. Examples: Commando Corps, Suidlanders, Bitterenders, Boer Legion. All of these groups are, as I say, paramilitary, and they claim to operate for defensive purposes, but generally say that they will activate in the event of civil unrest. I guess the concerning thing about that is that they don't really provide a definition of what civil unrest is. So the threshold for violent action is kind of difficult to know. I've included a picture of Dylan Roof there. He's a right-wing terrorist from the US, who referenced South Africa quite heavily in his manifesto as a kind of indication of the impact of the South African context on extremists around the world. And how do these groups abuse digital technologies? Well, fairly widely is the answer. We didn't find any indication that they're engaging in disruptive or destructive cyber operations. It was kind of mostly enabling. They operate their own websites, have pretty significant followings on mainstream platforms. Two examples there, I think, from Facebook and YouTube. 150,000 followers for one of those groups, so pretty significant. Of all of the groups, the Suidlanders are probably the most sophisticated. They've got their own app where there's an online marketplace, Bitcoin crowdfunding, recommendations for kind of prepper web stores and things like that within the app. And then also beyond these groups, there's a pretty extensive network of South Africa-based or South Africa-focused accounts on mainstream and more niche social media. Again, as I say, with strong connections to extremists around the world, particularly the US, Europe, and Australia. And with that, I'll pass back to Ottavia.
Thanks a lot, Arthur, for presenting the research findings. And as mentioned at the beginning, we would like to conclude with an overview of the recommendations of the report and a few words about next steps in regards to programmatic activities. So regarding recommendations, what we did was to try and make very actionable and concrete recommendations for our future work, but also for the work of other stakeholders involved. And we identified recommendations specific to 4 stakeholder groups. technology sector, research, member states, and international intergovernmental organizations. As you can imagine, the list of recommendations is not exhaustive, but the one we feature in the report are those that we think might require the most attention at this very moment. Before going into the specific recommendations, I would like to give a quick overview of the 4 main cross-cutting recommendations we identify, and they connect very well to many of the findings Arthur just presented. So first of all, what we have seen is that as a community, like all of us professionally working to prevent and counter these type of threats online, we should do more for moving away from conceptualizing online and offline spaces as being fundamentally separate. I think we can all agree that we're doing much better compared to the past, but perhaps more needs to be done in not considering digital platforms as the sole cause of issues for violent extremism, for instance, because in this way we would fail to recognize that violent extremism is fundamentally a people and societal problem, which is definitely often enabled or accelerated by digital technologies, but our approach should be to focus on the people and societal problem. The second cross-cutting recommendation goes back to what Arthur was presenting before, this growing evidence of how violent extremism online is not an isolated phenomenon. There is increasingly overlapping with other issues relating to online harms, including disinformation, misinformation, child sexual abuse material, cybercrime, all the way to mainstream authoritarian or radical politics, all aimed at disrupting democratic values in general. So I think that we think in this regard, more work should be done to improve the sharing of information between sectors across the industry working to tackle all these different threats. Third cross-cutting recommendation is to leverage what already exists within the Global South in regards to counterterrorism and PCVE initiative and mechanisms, but elevate these existing initiatives and mechanisms to a more digital layer and ensure that these existing initiatives address also the challenge posed by violent extremism in the digital realm. In this context, with the different stakeholders we talked to, the topic of South-South and triangular cooperation came up a few times as a means of facilitating international cooperation complementary to North-South cooperation. And this could manifest in more effective partnerships and coordination between technology companies and member states in the Global South. For instance, engaging in cross-jurisdictional collaboration on the issues of terrorist and violent extremist operated websites. In this regard, we think also that relevant UN agencies should invest in facilitating policy dialogue in a multi-stakeholder format to address concrete issues, such as the technology sector apparent underinvestment in moderating content in the Global South compared with what is done in the Global North. Fourth and last cross-cutting recommendation is around the key role of local communities and civil society organizations in this context, and how their work should be embedded in efforts to address violent extremist content online. Talking to different stakeholders during this research project, we have seen how communities and individuals would benefit from the involvement of civil society organizations in fostering media and information literacy, and dismantling information systems that rely on some of the threats we mentioned before, from hateful narratives, borderline content, misinformation, and disinformation campaigns. And these organizations should co-create initiatives, and they should also be seen as advisor for member states and technology companies in understanding how cultural and linguistic factors are leveraged by violent extremist actors in the spread of hateful narratives and extremist content. This would allow more context-responsive strategies and measures. Moving into recommendations specific for each sector. Again, as said, nothing is exhaustive, so we would love to hear if you have more recommendations later in the Q&A session. But really regarding research, two main aspects we identify is, first of all, more research into the manifestations of this type of violent extremism in the global south and how they exploit digital platforms, but also how local or domestic movements are influenced by international dynamics via digital technologies, and perhaps even with a focus on specific type of digital technologies. We have identified gaming and education platforms as interesting digital technologies to look into in this regard. And we think that regarding research on this matter, donors should allocate funds for projects that involve researchers and organizations based in these regions, as it goes back to what we were saying before. The cultural and linguistic knowledge would be much different, and insights into these factors would be very beneficial for research. The second recommendation for research focus more on the topic of activism. As Arthur mentioned before, we have seen some type of, if not collaboration, but mutual interest between different threat groups. And so we think that more research could be done into the radicalizing pathways to ideologies of movements affiliated with violent extremism, potentially followed by activists. And so the idea here is to look into like the radicalization pathway for individuals and movements whose involvement in extremism is confined to offensive digital activities. With regards to recommendation to the technology sector, one recommendation is around content removal. I think that we can all agree that content removal might work, but not always, meaning that we think complementary solutions are required to avoid that violative content return quickly elsewhere online, or the use of sophisticated tactics to evade content moderation would allow, again, content to resurface. And so solutions that we have gathered from the interviews from different stakeholders include complementary solutions, again, demonetization, education and review for users attempting to post potentially harmful content, but also fact-checking or community notes, and finally, contextual labeling of specific accounts or material by technology platforms. And in this, more cross-sector collaboration would be beneficial as well. And for instance, we think there are more widespread adoption of red team threat modeling by technology companies could enhance their understanding of how violent extremist actors take advantage of the company's services and products online. The second recommendation in regards to the technology sector is mostly to continue doing the work they're doing, meaning really continue to build and maintain effective collaboration and communication between companies. Of course, important to note, those companies that they're doing it, as I think we all know, there are some companies that they're not really eager to collaborate or work on these topics. But we think that more work should be done to support smaller or less resourced companies proactively, and to mutualize tactics and techniques and procedures to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism online, bearing in mind the differences between the functionalities and settings of different companies, of course. Moving to member states, going back to what I mentioned at the beginning on how we aim to have this recommendation quite concrete and actionable, we look into the aspect of capacity building most, meaning that one recommendation regards the capability of member states to investigate and disrupting these threats online, particularly in the dark web and encrypted communication platforms. Of course, we are aware that the broader online violent extremist ecosystem is also active on the surface and deep web, but the dark web continues to pose serious challenges to law enforcement investigations and the removal of illegal content in many jurisdictions. So more work should be done also between member states to share technical, investigative, or legislative tools that can be used in this regard. The second recommendation is mostly around cybersecurity. As Arthur mentioned before, the likelihood of cyber attacks led by ideologically motivated groups might have a bigger impact on countries, member states with less cybersecurity defenses. So it will be important to strengthen the cybersecurity of those countries in face of growing threat posed by cybercriminals, state-backed actors, and non-state actors with non-financial motivations. So again, ideologically motivated actors. And this would be particularly important in those countries with less knowledge or fewer resources, as mentioned before. To conclude, two main recommendations, to international and intergovernmental organization. The first recommendation is around the possibility to create more spaces and more time in the shape of strategic sessions, for instance, among member states to address definitions of contentious issues like violent extremism. And we think this is required because such definitions should not be the exclusive decision of private companies, nor should they be the only responsibility of national governments. And so relevant international organizations should foster multi-stakeholder dialogue on this, or have a harmonized international approach to definitional challenges. But you also think, going back to something that Arthur mentioned before, we think that in this context where tech companies are often in between national and local tensions, democratic governments should provide diplomatic support for technology companies when the companies are facing pressure from repressive governments to act in violation of international human rights. And this is something that was raised also by different stakeholders we interviewed from the regions at scope. And to conclude, perhaps like a broader recommendation to international organizations to really step up their responsibility to maintain international peace, I would say at this historical time in general, and not only in the realm of cyberspace, but as we know, often offline and online ecosystems are strictly interconnected. And so we think that specific briefings should focus on the interconnection of threats, including the important topic of cybersecurity, as the idea would be to draw member states' attention to threats that might not otherwise be present or recognized as sufficiently important in their countries, but they are actually growing internationally. And to conclude, and to showcase you very quickly what we are trying to do with all these important findings, insights, and recommendations, what we are focusing on UNICRI, based on the findings of this research, consultation with stakeholders and beneficiaries, but also findings from other ongoing research. The priority areas you see in the slides are what emerged as main areas to focus on. The first is around public-private cross-sectoral collaboration for alternative threat intelligence and information sharing mechanisms to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism online. As of now, we are thinking to involve social media companies, gaming companies, and cybersecurity companies to have this type of cross-sectoral collaboration, of course, involving member states as well. And at the same time, we would like to focus on the aspect of content moderation. We might not all agree on how content moderation works, but many things that it doesn't really work how it should. And so we are interested in exploring alternative ways, community-driven approaches to content moderation. It's something that's been discussed for a while now, and it's actually a topic that came up during a consultation session Arthur and I did during RightsCon last February. And on these two topics, we are planning to hold a stakeholder workshop and gather insights and best practices in a manual. So if anyone is interested, just feel free to reach out to me. The other priority areas, one is more connected to the convergence of violent extremism and child exploitation. Looking into the diverse manifestations of online harms, often overlapping, as mentioned before. And the dedicated focus on child exploitations goes beyond children and youth being victim, but also their involvement in violent acts and crimes, from cybercrime to offline violence. The third area is connected to our role of a training institute. So really the commitment to develop capacity building activities and offering technical assistance to member states. What we have seen, and what I also mentioned before, is really that many member states still lack proper training on online investigations, basing online investigations, including dark web, and also they lack the cybersecurity infrastructure to protect themselves from potential threats. And to conclude, which is, I think, a common theme in this report, and perhaps something that many of us have been working on, is really strengthening public-private partnership around the world, but specifically in the Global South. And what we have seen from previous work is that often there is a lack of contacts between tech sector and government agencies. And these make almost impossible for law enforcement to foster any type of collaboration, and even concretely speaking, advancing work on criminal investigations. And with this, we conclude our presentation, and I think we are in perfect type, I hope. Suraj, you let me know. But again, I would like to thank everybody, and again, VOX-Pol colleagues, Stuart, Louise, and Maura, for your fantastic support with this research. Thank you. Back to you, Suraj.
Thank you both, and yes, that was excellent timing. If we just jump straight into the questions, it's a fascinating discussion, and there's a lot to talk about. The first question has two parts. First of all, will this result in a report? Yes, it will. I've put the links into the chat. And secondly, will some of the OSINT data sources be mentioned explicitly? Arthur, can I come to you for that?
Well, the answer is no, we're not explicitly mentioning them, but we'd be happy to speak privately. So if you don't already have our emails, we can share them in the chat. Yeah, happy to kind of give more detailed information on them in private.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what strategies does UNICRI have to supporting countries like Mauritania in addressing challenges related to cybersecurity and online violent extremism, specifically given the growing spread of technology and our country's limited digital infrastructure? So slightly outside of what was talked about today, but still important.
Thank you, and thanks for the question. So we have been working in Africa regarding different projects, West Africa specifically, looking into the nexus of terrorism and organized crime. And in this regard, for instance, last year we delivered two national stakeholder meeting, one in Benin and one in Togo, on supporting law enforcement in online investigations and also the handling of electronic evidence. So these trainings were done in regards to this specific project looking into the nexus again, but we are always eager to organize specific trainings based on the requests of member states, of course, being member state one of our main audience. And similarly to this, we don't have a specific geographic scope as of now, but we are in the phase of developing project proposal looking into enhancing member states' capabilities into crisis response protocols, also the development of internet referral units within cybersecurity, cybercrime center, if a country, if a government has them. But again, these are all things, these are all aspects and elements that would need to be tailored to the specific context of and needs of a country. But so we are open to work on this, and we do have some experience on the topic, yeah.
There's also a follow-up question about how people can get involved with the work of UNICRI, but maybe we'll keep that towards the end. I'd like to jump in to talk more specifically about the report. If we think kind of more broadly to start with, in terms of the different types of technologies and specific online spaces used, and when thinking about tactics and approaches implemented by the far left and right groups that you looked at, were there any kind of key overlaps or divergences of importance?
Do you mean between left and right?
Between left and right, yes.
I think a key overlap is the general diversity of platforms and services being used, which I think I mentioned in the presentation. And I think that feeds into one of the recommendations, which is around, engaging bilaterally with one company is only going to go so far, and that the groups are just going to pick up on their other 6 accounts elsewhere. So I think that really speaks to the kind of ecosystem nature of this, particularly when you take into account the kind of declining provenance of organized groups. In terms of divergences, I think a more striking characteristic of some of the left-wing movements that we looked at, particularly those that are more aligned with the kind of international anarchist kind of world, is a reliance more on their own websites rather than necessarily using the larger tech companies. And I think there might be an element of ideology behind that as well as tactic, in that, ITS, for example, ironically, for a kind of rabidly anti-technology group, are actually pretty sophisticated in their use of technologies. But they relied much more on their own kind of self-hosted website and encrypted dark web servers to communicate. And although their content is available on a bunch of other sites, and actually I should say that this group is kind of mostly inactive as far as I can tell today, but they definitely seem to be less inclined to operate on the mainstream platforms. And I think another, maybe it's as parallel to your question, but it's just striking in general how the movements that we're looking at in this report were able to operate pretty openly without having to do any kind of sophisticated content moderation avoidance or anything on the larger platforms. And I think we tried to answer the why of that, and there's probably a bunch of different reasons, and it might be to do with the capacity of tech companies, it might be to do with their intent, but it might also be to do with kind of the jurisdiction and the legal classification or lack thereof of those movements as well.
Thank you. Ottavia, would you like to add anything to that?
No, not really. Arthur did perfectly. Thank you.
Great. Another question in the chat, and just a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Somebody's asking, can you say a little bit more about what you found regarding left-wing online violent extremist activity? I'm interested in this because in the past, colleagues and I, academic researchers, sought to do some work in this space in a European context, but we couldn't obtain sufficient violent extremist data. Obviously, the India case is quite different.
Yes. So I think I would re-emphasize the importance of standalone websites and blogs for the left-wing extremist movements. We focused on India and ITS in particular, because it's undeniable that their violence could be classified as violent extremist. I think there's a difficulty sometimes when talking about other left-wing extremist movements, where the line is between activism and violent extremism. So that was something we were conscious of, and that's why we opted for those two particular case studies. Um, but I mean, the CPIM context is unique, but it is also striking the overlaps between, for example, CPIM and anarchist left-wing extremist movements in Europe. Um, I think we mentioned it in the report, and I can't remember which year it was, but there was a conference in, I think it was in Milan a few years ago, essentially in support of that movement. And that, I think, comes back to um, the point around transnational connections, and that although all of these different domestic contexts are obviously wholly unique, the internet is a way that they can all be quite closely interlinked, and different movements with different sympathies or worldviews often end up talking to each other or hanging out in similar spaces.
With that, something that Ottavia mentioned. Sorry, Ottavia, did you want to come in to?
Yeah, yes and no. Meaning, I mean, I don't know much about it because I'm not covering this specifically at UNICRI, but I do have a colleague working specifically on environmental crime, and it seems that many within European context, few law enforcement agencies are looking into anarchist movement connected to environmental crime. Specifically. So I don't know if that could be a lead, and I would be happy to put you in touch with my colleague working on the topic. But it seems that the all the aspect on climate security, environmental crime are very much connected to this type of movement. Yeah.
And actually, maybe I'm just had another thought, maybe diverging slightly from the answer, but it's parallel. We did also have a lot of thought and some difficulty in the context of defining violent extremism, and particularly in the context of hacking and hacktivism, and how you're able to draw the line between a hacktivist and a violent extremist, and to what point does an online action, to what point can you consider an online action to be violent? And we didn't necessarily have an answer to that, but I think it's quite an important thing to consider, particularly, as the years go by and technology continues to advance with AI and all of these things, how these definitions can be applied. And in the left-wing space, that applies to, obviously probably the most well-known activist group is Anonymous, right? And how you can go about defining these kind of actors, because at the same time, in the India case study, there are lots of kind of Hindu nationalist or pro-government activist groups that are kind of mounting these offensive cyber operations, and how you can classify those movements, even if their worldview might align with more violent actors, but it's difficult to know where the connection is. So that was a rant that wasn't entirely connected to the question, but it came into my mind.
Thank you both. Someone's asking regarding Hindu nationalism, did this report find any online platforms, forums being run by diaspora communities? Their own personal PhD research will be looking at Hindu nationalism online in the UK.
The short answer is no. That doesn't mean, obviously, that they don't exist. It just means that that wasn't our focus. We were quite specifically focused on the Indian context, and I'm sure the person asking the question knows more about the impact on diaspora communities than we do, but for sure there's a big influence, right? And again, it ties back to the point around global connectivity of these different movements. Obviously, the unrest in Leicester is a good example of that. But yeah, sorry, the answer is no. Ottavia?
Yeah, no, if I can just quickly jump in, something that I remember from the different interviews we did to expert on India specifically, and I think perhaps connecting to the element of diaspora was like the large use of WhatsApp, right? And how for sure this type in the Indian context, I think is quite important, because as this being used as an important medium of communication, definitely some type of narratives and messages would arrive also to perhaps Indian nationals outside Indian borders, right? So yeah, just reiterating what Arthur said, definitely there is, but wasn't really our focus, even though, yeah, the use of WhatsApp was really stressed by most of the interviewees. Thank you.
And there's some really great research out there which focuses on diaspora's use of WhatsApp to spread dis and misinformation, which is available online. So we just had another question come through. So in terms of kind of violent extremist networks continuing to exploit multiple platforms simultaneously, using outlink between platforms to evade detection. Can you talk a bit more about the use of these platforms by different actors? So as we've seen in cases around the world, different platforms are used for different purposes and have different priorities for extremist actors and groups. So if we take recruitment attempts or propaganda distribution as an example, have any of the groups in the global south that you looked at used different types of platform architecture to undertake these activities? And can we, is there a kind of other overlaps and differences between similar types of activities being conducted within Western contexts?
Yes. I think there's definitely a lot of parallels, and personally, I found it striking that the way in which violent extremist actors around the world are using the platform, there's not like huge amounts of difference. Uh, if you cast aside the difference in responses. As an example, one of the particular cases we looked at was a live stream shooting in Delhi by a kind of Hindu nationalist extremist who live streamed that attack on Facebook. That didn't involve the same kind of sophisticated use of different online platforms and services, possibly because that individual didn't feel the need. But I guess if we look at the Brazilian context and the right-wing extremists there are a lot of similarities between the way that they use different online services and extremists in kind of Europe and North America do. They congregate on platforms often that are run by extremists themselves, like the Chan sites I was talking about earlier, and that's where kind of most of their unredacted and unwithheld kind of communications take place. But then at the same time, they're posting the more kind of entryist recruitment stuff on the larger services, with an emphasis on the services where their content is least likely to be removed. Likewise, in South Africa, it's a similar kind of story. These groups are advertising themselves on the platforms that are most likely to be used by, I guess, their target audience, the Facebooks and the Googles. But at the same time, they're operating more private chats, and sometimes they're inviting prospective members into private encrypted channels where they're talking about more operational stuff, organizing events. And in the case of the Sudlanders, they've got their own app, which we didn't attempt to access. I think we had to be a member anyway if we wanted to access, and that would involve giving them money. So we obviously didn't do that. But I think in general, it's difficult to know the extent to which the use of different platforms and services is like a tactical or strategic decision on behalf of extremist movements, or whether it's just a reflection of the fact that everyone uses loads of different apps and services and they all have different product offerings. And probably the answer is that it's a bit of both.
So it's a couple of follow-up questions actually. Maybe I'll kind of start with the ecosystem question. kind of sophisticated use of ecosystems was mentioned by both of you, and also kind of mentioned in the report as well. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of online ecosystems for some of the groups that you looked at? And also, was there kind of any indication around reasons for migrating between different parts of that online ecosystem?
Yes. So as I said, there are identifiable groups. So maybe I'll use South Africa as a case study rather than attempting to talk about the whole world. And some of those groups like Commando Court, Suedlanders, AWB are examples of kind of, in some respect, kind of traditional organized named groups that meet up in person and have their own website. And they serve a role in a much broader ecosystem, which is much more loosely defined by worldview, and potentially their domestic focus, although not always domestic focus. And I think in some respects, the South African context is the most striking example of this because it's so intertwined with right-wing extremist ecosystems around the world, to the point where you get kind of influences from the UK and the US traveling down there to, see for themselves the plight of Afrikaner community, and kind of pushing their narrative to try and get it into mainstream discourse in other parts of the world. And from a technical or legal response point of view, it's something that's probably a lot more challenging to deal with, because you're not talking about an identifiable group that might have been responsible for some crimes that might justify some kind of legal action against it, but it's a much more kind of harder to define worldview of a selection of groups and actors and anonymous users. So yeah, I just think that makes it a lot more challenging. But obviously, what I'm saying isn't new. We've been saying this about groups like ISIS and right-wing extremism in other parts of the world, but it's just interesting to observe it elsewhere, as well. And I think, I could have said a lot of those things with reference to the Indian context as well, and it would still have been true by and large.
Thank you. Somebody had their hand up. It's difficult to come to people live. If you can please put your question in the Q&A, and I'll definitely get to it. A related question in terms of mainstreaming. So has the kind of normalization and mainstreaming of far-right extremism globally had any kind of effect on the case studies you looked at? But by this, I think what's meant is that when we look at other examples around the world of extremist networks and violent extremist networks distributing propaganda on social media spaces, etc., they often tap into national and international geopolitical issues and that wider populations are concerned with in order to kind of increase engagement, shares, and likes. So examples of this might include issues around migration or conspiracy theories around great replacement, or issues around the perception that feminism is a purposeful strategy to affect masculinity, and the place of men in society, trans issues, etc. Was there any of this that you found within your own research to really kind of force that engagement with wider kind of communities within that kind of geographical region, but more widely as well?
Yes, I think, and in some respects, this really comes back to the challenges around definitions, because and also power dynamics, to be honest. And I think some of the challenges that tech companies face is that what one person might consider to be extremist, might be fairly mainstream in another context. And we did cover, for example, in the report, from the whistleblower files from Facebook, and some examples of Meta kind of bending its policies essentially to be in line with, different cultural attitudes in other parts of the world, and that's a real challenge that they face. and that for tech companies to take action against content that might be sanctioned by a given government in a positive way is really challenging for them reputationally and, to be honest, in terms of their profit margins as well. So that's why the kind of definition point is so important, I think, and that's why it's one of our kind of key recommendations. Maybe we're being overly optimistic that we might be able to reach better definitions, but I think it's really important when we're talking about issues around the world that we know what we're talking about, really, when we're referring to it. Ottavia, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your question, Suraj, I think that among the different case studies, something very interesting about one case study interesting for this transnational but also very localized type of threat is the case study on the maritime Southeast Asia, where, I mean, for lack of time and resources, we couldn't go into every specific country. But we, at the same time, we saw some common trends, but also within communities, the importance of stressing out how Malay user would say things differently compared to an Indonesian user, right? So there is this feeling of belonging to the same type of community, but at the same time, not really. And so I think that is also something quite hard to tackle because, of course, firstly, I would say for the language, but also, and I think we have seen examples, I mean, on the use of hashtags and memes that would be used also in European or North American culture, but with a different valence behind, right? And if you don't know it, you might see as harmless, I guess. So I think in this regard, that case study is very interesting, and we would have loved to go deeper into every single case studies. We also have interviewees telling us, yes, but Malay context is very different from Indonesian context. So like, yes, we know, but we don't really have the time. So yeah, perhaps that is also something very interesting to look into from a research perspective.
Thank you both. And the kind of issue of memes is really interesting as a vehicle that can potentially help to transcend various geographical, cultural, and language barriers as well. I also want to get to the question about tech companies' roles and also kind of regulation as well. But we've had a really interesting question in the chat, something we haven't touched upon yet. The question is about, do you know about investigations that started by tracking the money that finance these groups? What platforms do they use? Is there any studies on how these groups use platforms to send money?
I guess there's no straightforward answer to that to talk to all of the different contexts, because probably the answer is different depending on which group or context we're talking about. But I could touch on a few little examples. I'd encourage you to read the sections of the report where we cover them. But in Brazil, for example, I think I mentioned NetLab, who we interviewed as part of the research. They've done some really good research into monetization by right-wing extremists on mainstream platforms in Brazil as a way of kind of drawing revenue. In South Africa, the Suidlanders, for example, they do crowdsource or crowdfund, sorry, but they do also just have membership fees, which I understand from one of our interviewees is kind of one of their main sources of income. And probably actually for a lot of the other kind of violent extremist movements we're talking about, it's not necessarily something that requires a great degree of financing. If we're talking about Chan communities in Brazil that are producing school shooters, I mean, I don't know who's funding the website itself, but that movement, mounting fairly low sophistication attacks, probably the financing isn't that important to that. So that was quite a rambly answer, but I think it just fully depends on which actor we're talking about and which jurisdiction we're talking about as well.
If I can just quickly complement from the perspective of member states, this is something that often comes as a request to, if we we do, I mean, as a UN, we don't really, but if we work with stakeholders that follow these, that pursue the follow the money approach, which is used in many other type of crime prevention strategies. So this is definitely something interesting for member states to be trained on and investigate. And most of them, they understand the importance of it. And I think South Africa is a good example of it, as Arthur mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you both. We're fast running out of time, and I think that's testimony to how important and interesting this topic is. I think we really need to at least focus on something that you both mentioned throughout your presentation, and that is, tech companies' responsibility to disrupt this type of material, individuals and groups. Within the report, you talk about how some tech companies are not adequately fulfilling their content moderation policies, and you also talk about how they face significant challenges as well. I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit more, and also reiterate and expand upon some of the recommendations that you made towards the end of the presentation.
Yes. So, as I say, it was a pretty running theme that when we were doing the interviews, the prevailing kind of view was that, broadly speaking, if you're talking about an extremist movement in a particular part of India, the capability of a big tech company to deal with that, or frankly, probably prioritization, doesn't match up to other kind of movements that are more likely to affect their reputation. We cite in the report some statistics, and the actual kind of amount of data on this is a little difficult to access because it's generally inside these big private corporations. But some of the whistleblower files that we looked at, and there's also some transparency reporting that we cite, I think under the DSA in the EU, it cites kind of the number of linguists that these companies employ. And with a caveat that that's obviously confined to the EU, so it's not necessarily applying to a lot of the context we're talking about, but just the number of English language moderators compared to the others was huge. And if you account for kind of population sizes in these parts of the world, then it's kind of actually quite shocking. But on the challenges side, and I think I alluded a moment ago to some of the political and legal pressures that the companies are facing from lots of different actors, some of them potentially repressive governments, can put tech companies in quite a sticky situation when they've got global policies that they're hopefully trying to enforce, but often will clash against certain jurisdictions or definitions of what constitutes an extremist group. And as I say, I think we cite an example from the Indian context involving Meta in the report. So I'd encourage everyone to go and look at that one. Ottavia, do you want to talk about some of the recommendations?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think that from our perspective, something that really looks like a low-hanging fruit, but at the same time is extremely complicated to make it happen, is this more collaboration from even just sharing contact details between specific government agencies in the Global South and technology companies. And as you can understand, if there is no that starting point, it's extremely hard to go anywhere. And so we are really advocating for more of this type of collaboration, also to find ways to perhaps support technology companies finding themselves in a situations like Arthur just depicted. But I think also the element of finding new and complementary solutions to content removal, as we mentioned before, would be very relevant. Like content removal in some, like most of the research Arthur did for this report, everything was just on mainstream platforms. And so the narrative that using content removal works, it's not really true in this context. So I think that, of course, we need to look at these threats in the Global South from a different lens. And we need to start from the very bottom. And something that also we are looking into for different research is how there is a growing trend of local platforms, local forums growing in these countries, and nobody is aware of them because nobody is using them outside this context, and so there is no regulation within these platforms. We can go back to the problem of smaller platforms, right? So I think there are so many aspects that we should tackle, but yeah, it definitely requires more collaboration and interest in collaboration, which is the power behind, I guess.
I had another thought on that, and I know that we're 1 minute past, is on first of all, content removal. We know serves an important role in all of this, but ISIS is still all over Facebook, and that's probably the group that's been most heavily focused on by the industry for the past however long. So it obviously doesn't work on its own. And even, using this ISIS example, probably the most widely designated group in the world, the vast majority of the groups we're looking at in this report or networks aren't illegal. And I think that also, in some respects, you're relying on tech companies to often go beyond what's required of them in the law in those different countries. So I think that's just another thing to flag, really, in the context of the stuff not necessarily being actioned.
Thank you both. Yeah, really, really important points in such a complicated area to kind of try to navigate. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I did also want to talk about regulatory mechanisms, but this is a topic we can talk about for hours. I'd like to finish by first of all thanking our brilliant speakers today for a real fascinating insight into the topic, and also thanks to UNICRI and VOX-Pol for making both the report and webinar happen. As you would have noticed, I've posted links to the report, to UNICRI's website, VOX-Pol's website, and the newly formed NGO, the VOX-Pol Institute's website as well, into the chat, so do please save these links. The VOX-Pol webinar will also be available on VOX-Pol's YouTube page eventually, where you can find other interesting webinars and talks as well. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of day.